The wind howled like a wounded animal as Emma Hayes watched the approaching black funnel cloud through her kitchen window. Her hands trembled on the wooden windowsill, knuckles white with fear. The tornado was coming straight for her isolated homestead, and there wasn't a soul around for miles to help her, until there was. A galloping horse emerged from the swirling dust, its rider bent low over the saddle. Emma squinted through the dimming light as the man dismounted in one fluid motion, tethering his horse to her porch post before pounding on her door. "Madam, you need to get to shelter now." The stranger's voice carried even through the howling wind. Emma flung open the door to find a tall man with dirt-streaked features and intense blue eyes. His worn Stetson was pulled low against the wind, and a deputy's badge glinted on his chest. "I don't have a shelter," she shouted back, clutching her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The man glanced at the approaching storm, then back at her. "Yes, you do." Without waiting for permission, he grabbed her hand. "I'm Deputy Marshal Mason Irwin. Your husband built a storm cellar behind this house 3 years ago. Where is he?" "Dead," Emma replied, allowing herself to be pulled along. "Fever took him last winter. I never knew about any cellar." The deputy mason nodded grimly as he led her around the back of her house. Sure enough, partially hidden by overgrown prairie grass was a slanted wooden door set into the ground. He yanked it open, revealing a set of stairs descending into darkness. "Get in," he ordered, his voice softening slightly despite the urgency. "I need to grab my horse." "You'll never make it back," Emma protested as the roar of the approaching tornado grew deafening. Mason hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "You're right." Without another word, he placed his hand on the small of her back and guided her down into the darkness. The cellar door slammed shut behind them just as the first violent tremors shook the ground, sealing them together in the darkness as the tornado bore down on Emma's home. It was Wyoming territory, 1873, and neither of them knew that this moment would change both their lives forever. The darkness of the storm cellar engulfed them. Emma could hear Mason's breathing, steady despite the chaos erupting above them. A match flared to life, illuminating his face in a warm glow as he located and lit a lantern hanging from a ceiling beam. "Your husband was a forward-thinking man," Mason said, his eyes scanning the well-stocked cellar. Shelves lined the walls, filled with preserved foods, jugs of water, blankets, and other emergency supplies. "Not many folks out here build proper storm shelters." Emma ran her fingers along the rough-hewn support beams. "Thomas never mentioned it. He was always working on something, though, said a man should provide security for his family even in his absence." Her voice caught. "I guess he meant it." The cellar shuddered violently, dirt sifting down from between the wooden planks overhead. Mason instinctively stepped closer to Emma, one hand going to her elbow to steady her. "How long have you been alone out here?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the storm's rage. 4 months, Emma replied. "Thomas homesteaded this land 2 years ago. We came out from Pennsylvania with such dreams." She glanced up at him. "What brings a deputy marshal out in this weather?" Mason moved to sit on a wooden crate, removing his hat and placing it beside him. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat and rain. "Tracking a horse thief headed toward Fort Laramie. Lost his trail when the storm started brewing. Saw your place and..." He shrugged. "Something told me to check if anyone was home. Good thing I listened." The building above them groaned ominously. Emma hugged herself tighter, trying to hide her fear. She'd weathered many storms since coming west, but never one like this, and never alone in the darkness with a stranger. "It sounds like it's tearing everything apart," she whispered. "Tornadoes can be cruel that way," Mason replied. "They'll skip one house and demolish another, No rhyme or reason to them. An especially violent shake sent Emma stumbling forward. Mason caught her by the shoulders, steadying her against his chest for just a moment before politely setting her back on her feet. "My apologies, Mrs. Hayes," he said formally. "Emma," she corrected him. "And there's no need for apologies when you've likely saved my life." They fell silent, listening to the storm's fury. Minutes stretched into an hour, the noise eventually diminishing from a freight train's roar to an angry growl and finally to an eerie silence. Mason stood, dusting off his trousers. "I should check what's left up there." "I'm coming with you," Emma said firmly, already moving toward the stairs. He looked as though he might argue, then nodded. "Stay behind me, just in case." Mason pushed against the cellar door, which at first refused to budge. He braced his shoulder against it and heaved upward. The door finally gave way, and they emerged into a world transformed. Emma's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a cry. Where her modest farmhouse had stood was now a jumble of splintered wood, broken furniture, and scattered possessions. Only a portion of the kitchen wall remained standing, the window through which she'd first spotted the tornado somehow intact, an absurd frame for the devastation beyond. Mason surveyed the destruction, his expression grim. "I'm sorry, Emma." She moved forward as if in a trance, carefully picking her way through the debris. Her fingers brushed against a shattered picture frame containing a daguerreotype of her and Thomas on their wedding day. The glass was cracked, but the image remained. "At least I'm alive," she finally said, her voice stronger than she felt. "Where's your horse?" They found the animal trembling but unharmed, huddled against the remains of the barn where it had sought shelter after breaking free from the porch post. The structure itself was mostly gone, the roof torn away entirely. "You can't stay here," Mason said, leading his horse back to where Emma stood amid the ruins of her home. "I don't have anywhere else to go." She knelt to retrieve a dented tin box from the rubble, her emergency funds and few pieces of jewelry, thankfully intact. "Fort Laramie's about 12 miles east," Mason said. "I know a widow there who takes in boarders. Mrs. Whitaker. She's good people." He hesitated. "I could take you there." Emma looked around at the life she and Thomas had built, now scattered across the prairie. Night was falling and the air carried a damp chill. "I suppose I don't have much choice," she said, straightening her shoulders. Mason's expression softened. "Let me help you gather whatever can be salvaged. We'll make camp tonight and head to town in the morning." As they worked side by side in the fading light, Emma found herself stealing glances at the deputy. There was something comforting in his competent movements, the careful way he handled her few remaining possessions. When his fingers accidentally brushed hers as they both reached for a fallen book, Emma felt a jolt that had nothing to do with the lingering storm electricity in the air. She quickly withdrew her hand, reminding herself that her heart was supposed to be buried with Thomas. Yet as Mason built a small fire from the broken pieces of her former life, Emma couldn't help but feel that something new and unexpected was stirring in the ashes of what had been lost. Dawn broke clear and cool over the devastated landscape. Emma had slept fitfully beneath Mason's spare blanket, the hard ground a poor substitute for her feather bed. She rose to find the deputy already awake, tending to his horse and organizing their meager supplies for the journey to Fort Laramie. "I found some of your clothing relatively intact," Mason said, gesturing to a small pile of garments he'd folded neatly beside her bundle of salvaged possessions. His eyes remained respectfully averted as he spoke. "And there's coffee, if you'd like some." Emma accepted the tin cup gratefully, warming her hands around it. "Thank you," she said, her voice still rough with sleep, "for everything." Mason nodded once, a man uncomfortable with gratitude. We should reach town by midday if we start soon. They shared a simple breakfast of jerky and hardtack from Mason's saddlebags, then set about loading her salvaged belongings onto his horse. The animal, a sturdy chestnut gelding named Rusty, snorted in protest at the additional weight. "I can walk," Emma offered, seeing Mason's concern. "Not 12 miles in those boots, you can't," he replied, eyeing her impractical footwear. "We'll ride double. Rusty can handle it." And so Emma found herself perched behind Deputy Irwin on his saddle, her arms hesitantly circling his waist as they set off across the rolling prairie. The morning sun gradually burned away the mist, revealing a landscape washed clean by the storm. Wildflowers nodded in the gentle breeze, a stark contrast to the destruction they'd left behind. "Have you been a lawman long?" Emma asked, trying to distract herself from the unfamiliar intimacy of their shared saddle. 5 years, Mason replied. "Served with the Union Army before that, came west after the war like a lot of men. And your family?" There was a slight stiffening in his posture. "Lost my parents young." "No siblings. The law is my family now, I suppose." Emma absorbed this information in silence. A man alone in the world just as she was now. The thought brought an unexpected pang of kinship. "What will you do now?" Mason asked after a while. "Will you return east?" Emma considered the question. Back in Pennsylvania, she had a married sister and aging parents who had opposed her western adventure from the start. Returning would mean admitting defeat, facing their well-intentioned pity. "No," she said with sudden certainty. "The West may be harsh, but it's home now. I'll find work in Fort Laramie, save enough to rebuild or buy new land." Mason glanced over his shoulder at her, surprise evident in his blue eyes. "Most women would be on the first eastbound stage after what you've been through." "I'm not most women, Deputy Irwin." A small smile tugged at his lips. "No, Mrs. Hayes, I don't believe you are." They rode in companionable silence after that, the rhythmic gait of the horse lulling Emma into a state of calm contemplation. Despite her brave words, uncertainty gnawed at her. What work could she find in a frontier town? Her skills were those of a farmer's wife, cooking, sewing, gardening, basic animal husbandry. Hardly enough to support herself independently. By mid-morning, the distant outlines of Fort Laramie came into view. Unlike the romanticized forts of dime novels, it was a sprawling collection of wooden buildings surrounded by a growing civilian settlement that had sprung up to serve the military outpost. Smoke curled from chimneys, and even from a distance, Emma could see people moving about their business. "It's larger than I expected," she remarked. "The fort proper is primarily military," Mason explained. "But the town's been growing steadily. Railway surveyors came through last year. Once the tracks are laid, it'll boom even more." They approached the outskirts of town, drawing curious glances from passers-by. Emma became acutely aware of her disheveled appearance and the intimacy of their shared mount. In a small community like Fort Laramie, gossip traveled faster than telegraphers' Morse code. Mason seemed to sense her discomfort. "Mrs. Whittaker's boarding house is on the eastern edge of town. We can avoid the main thoroughfare." Emma nodded gratefully, even as a pang of disappointment struck her. Soon they would reach their destination, and Deputy Irwin would continue his pursuit of the horse thief. Their brief connection, born of crisis, would end. It was for the best, of course. She was a recent widow and he a lawman with responsibilities. Yet she couldn't help feeling a sense of loss for something that had never truly begun. Mrs. Olive Whittaker turned out to be a brisk, no-nonsense widow in her 50s with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a surprisingly gentle manner. She took one look at Emma's bedraggled state and shepherded her inside the tidy 2-story boarding house, clucking sympathetically over her tale of the tornado's destruction. "You poor dear," she said, ushering Emma toward a chair in her kitchen. "Deputy Irwin, fetch Miss Peterson from next door. She's about Mrs. Hayes's size and might have some clothing to spare until we can get to the mercantile." Mason nodded and disappeared, leaving Emma alone with her new landlady. "Now then," Mrs. Whittaker said, placing a cup of hot tea before Emma, "I have a small room available. It's modest, mind you, but clean and with its own wash basin. $2 a week, meals included." Emma's heart sank. Even with the money she'd salvaged, that rate would deplete her savings within months if she didn't find work quickly. I may not be able to stay long-term," she admitted. "Until I secure employment," Mrs. Whittaker waved away her concerns. "Deputy Irwin explained your situation. The first week is taken care of. After that, we'll work something out. I could use help with the cooking and laundry for my other boarders." Relief flooded Emma. "I'm a good cook and I don't mind hard work." "I can see that," the older woman replied with a knowing look. "Not many women would survive what you have and still stand so tall." She patted Emma's hand. "Rest today. Tomorrow is soon enough to worry about what comes next." Mason returned with a young woman carrying a bundle of clothing. Introductions were made. Elizabeth Peterson was the schoolteacher's wife and seemed delighted to help. Emma found herself whisked upstairs to a small but immaculate room, where she was finally able to wash away the grime of the tornado and change into clean garments. When she descended the stairs an hour later, feeling human again, she found Mason waiting in the parlor, hat in hands. "I've settled your account for the week," he said quietly, "and spoken with Sheriff Daniels about your situation. He mentioned the hotel is looking for help with their laundry and mending." Emma felt a flush of pride rising to her cheeks. "You needn't have gone to such trouble on my behalf." "It's no trouble," Mason replied. "It's the least I could do." An awkward silence fell between them. Emma was acutely aware that this was goodbye, yet neither seemed eager to speak the words. "Well," Mason finally said, settling his hat back on his head, "I should report to the sheriff's office and continue tracking that horse thief. He's got a 2-day head start now, of course." Emma extended her hand formally. "Thank you again, Deputy Irwin, for saving my life." He took her hand, holding it perhaps a moment longer than propriety dictated. "Take care of yourself, Mrs. Hayes." Emma watched from the boarding house porch as Mason mounted Rusty and rode toward the sheriff's office, a strange emptiness filling her chest. She told herself it was merely the aftermath of losing her home, the natural melancholy of displacement. Yet she knew, even then, that it was something more, something she wasn't ready to name. The next few weeks passed in a blur of adjustment and hard work. True to Mason's word, the hotel had hired Emma to handle their laundry and mending. The work was exhausting, leaving her hands raw and her back aching, but it paid fairly. Combined with her reduced board in exchange for helping Mrs. Whittaker, Emma found herself able to save a small amount each week. Fort Laramie proved to be a close-knit community despite its transient military population. Emma gradually formed friendships with Elizabeth Peterson and Sarah Johnson, the mercantile owner's daughter. Through them, she learned more about the town's residents and its rhythms. Of Deputy Mason Irwin, however, she heard little. He had returned from his pursuit of the horse thief empty-handed, according to town gossip, and had been sent immediately to escort a prisoner to Cheyenne. Emma told herself she wasn't disappointed by his absence. After all, what claim did she have on his attention? Their connection had been circumstantial, nothing more. Yet on the rare occasions when she glimpsed him riding through town or standing outside the sheriff's office, Emma found her heart beating a touch faster, her awareness heightening in a way that both thrilled and troubled her. It was nearly a month after the tornado when Mason appeared at Mrs. Whitaker's boarding house just as Emma was hanging laundry in the back garden. She nearly dropped the sheet she was pinning to the line when he rounded the corner, looking as startled to see her as she was to see him. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, removing his hat. "I hope you're well." "I am, thank you," Emma replied, suddenly conscious of her work-worn hands and simple dress. "And you, Deputy, can't complain." His eyes moved past her to the clothesline. "I see you found employment." "At the hotel, yes, and I helped Mrs. Whitaker here in exchange for reduced board." Mason nodded, seeming unsure how to continue. "Finally," he said, "I rode out to your homestead yesterday. Thought you might want to know that the storm cellar is still intact, and there are some items scattered about that might be worth salvaging." Emma's heart quickened. She hadn't had the means to return to her land, lacking both transportation and time off from work. "That's kind of you to check. I could take you there," he offered. "Sunday, perhaps, if you're not working, might be some personal things you'd want to recover." The thought of returning to the site of her loss made Emma's chest tighten, but she knew he was right. There might be treasured mementos she'd missed in their hasty departure. "I would appreciate that," she said softly. "I'll come by after church then." Mason settled his hat back on his head, then hesitated. "I'm glad you're doing well here, Emma." It was the first time he'd used her given name since their initial meeting, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent an unexpected warmth through her. "Thank you, Mason," she replied, feeling bold in returning the familiarity. His eyes met hers for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them before he nodded once and took his leave. Emma remained motionless, the forgotten sheet flapping in the breeze, her mind racing with possibilities she hadn't allowed herself to consider until now. Sunday dawned clear and mild, a perfect early summer day. Emma dressed with unusual care in her one good dress, a blue calico that Elizabeth had helped her alter to fit properly. She attended the morning church service, finding herself unable to focus on Reverend Walsh's sermon, her thoughts constantly straying to the afternoon ahead. Mason was waiting outside Mrs. Whitaker's when she returned, his horse saddled, and a second-mounted gentle-looking dun mare tethered beside him. "Borrowed her from the livery," he explained as Emma approached. "Thought you might prefer riding on your own rather than sharing again." Emma wasn't entirely sure she agreed, but nodded appreciatively anyway. That was thoughtful. The ride to her former homestead took them across rolling grasslands dotted with late spring wildflowers. Away from the constraints of town, conversation flowed more easily between them. Mason spoke of his time in the Union Army during the war, of his decision to head west rather than return to his native Ohio. Emma shared stories of her childhood in Pennsylvania, her courtship with Thomas, and their dreams of building a life on the frontier. "He was a good man," she said as they crested a rise that would soon reveal what remained of her homestead. "Hard-working, kind, we were partners in everything." "You must miss him terribly," Mason said quietly. Emma considered this as the ruins of her home came into view. "I do," she admitted. "But strangely, it's not with the sharp pain I expected, more like an ache for what might have been." She glanced at Mason. "Is that disloyal, do you think?" "No," he replied without hesitation. "It's human. Life continues for those left behind. I think a good man would want that for his wife." They dismounted near the storm cellar, tethering their horses to a surviving fence post. The destruction looked even more complete in the bright daylight than it had in the aftermath of the tornado. Nature was already reclaiming the site, grass growing through the debris, wildflowers sprouting amid the scattered timber. Emma moved slowly through the ruins, occasionally stooping to examine an item before either discarding it or adding it to a small pile of salvageable goods. Mason followed at a respectful distance, offering assistance when needed but otherwise allowing her this necessary pilgrimage through her past. In what had been her bedroom, Emma uncovered a small wooden box beneath a section of collapsed wall. Her hands trembled as she opened it, revealing her mother's cameo brooch, Thomas's pocket watch, and several letters tied with faded ribbon. "I thought these were lost," she whispered, clutching the box to her chest. Mason knelt beside her, his hand coming to rest lightly on her shoulder. "Sometimes the most important things find a way to survive." Emma looked up to find his face closer than expected, his blue eyes filled with a warmth that stirred something long dormant within her. For a breathless moment, she thought he might lean closer still, but instead, he rose and offered his hand to help her up. They continued their careful exploration, eventually accumulating a modest collection of recovered possessions enough to fill Mason's saddlebags, but not much more. As the sun began its westward descent, they made their way back to the horses. "The land is still yours," Mason said as Emma took a final look at the homestead. "The Homestead Act gives you rights to it for 5 years from the original claim. What good is land without a house or means to farm it?" Emma asked ruefully. Mason shifted, seeming uncomfortable. "I've been meaning to tell you. There's a position opening up at the Fort Laundress for the officers' quarters. It pays better than the hotel with quarters provided. I mentioned your name to the quartermaster." Emma turned to him in surprise. "You did?" "Only if you're interested," he added quickly. "I know it's not the same as having your own land, but it might allow you to save enough to rebuild someday." The thought of living at the fort, being part of that community, appealed to Emma more than she expected. And the fact that Mason had thought of her, had advocated for her without being asked, stirred emotions she'd been trying to keep at bay. "Thank you," she said softly. "I would be very interested." The smile that lit Mason's face made something flutter in Emma's chest. As they mounted their horses and turned back toward Fort Laramie, she found herself not mourning what she had lost, but instead looking forward to what might lie ahead. The position at the fort proved to be a turning point for Emma. The work was hard but satisfying, and the quarters, a small but private room in the laundress's building, gave her a sense of independence she had missed. The military routine provided structure to her days, and the increased wages allowed her savings to grow steadily. More significant than these practical improvements, however, was her evolving relationship with Deputy Mason Irwin. His duties frequently brought him to the fort, and he made a habit of seeking her out during these visits. At first, their encounters were brief and public, a shared meal in the mess, a few minutes of conversation while she hung laundry, an exchange of greetings as their paths crossed. Gradually, these moments lengthened and deepened. Mason began escorting Emma to Sunday services, joining her for dinner at Mrs. Whittaker's boarding house when she visited her friends in town, and inviting her on short rides in the surrounding countryside when their duties permitted. By late summer, few in Fort Laramie were surprised to see the deputy and the laundress together. Their courtship, while never formally declared, was conducted with the quiet dignity that characterized them both. It was during one of their Sunday afternoon rides in early September that Mason finally spoke of feelings both had left unvoiced. They had stopped to rest their horses by a small creek, the cottonwoods above them beginning to show hints of gold among their green leaves. Emma sat on a fallen log, watching a pair of meadowlarks flit among the tall grasses while Mason saw to the horses. "I've been thinking," he said, settling beside her on the log, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "A dangerous pastime," Emma teased gently. Mason smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. "Perhaps." He plucked a stem of grass, twisting it between his fingers. "I've been offered a promotion. Sheriff Daniels is retiring next month. He and the town council have asked me to take his place." "Mason, that's wonderful news," Emma exclaimed. "You'd make an excellent sheriff." "It would mean staying in Fort Laramie permanently," he continued. "Setting down roots." Emma nodded, sensing there was more to this conversation than a career announcement. "I've lived a solitary life since the war," Mason said, his eyes on the distant mountains. "Told myself it was better that way. A lawman's life is unpredictable, dangerous at times. Didn't seem fair to ask anyone to share that burden." He turned to face her then, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. "But meeting you has made me question that decision." Emma's heart quickened. "Has it? You lost everything in that tornado, Emma. Your home, your possessions, the life you'd built with Thomas. Yet you never broke. Never surrendered to despair." Mason's hand found hers, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "Your strength, your resilience, it awes me. Makes me believe that perhaps sharing life's burdens isn't a weakness but a strength of its own." Emma's throat tightened with emotion. "What are you saying, Mason?" "I'm saying that I care for you, Emma Hayes, more than I thought possible." His blue eyes held hers steadily. "I know it's only been a few months since we met. I know you're still healing from your loss. But I wanted you to know my feelings and my intentions if you should ever find yourself ready to consider a future together." Tears pricked at Emma's eyes. Not tears of sorrow, but of a complicated joy she hadn't expected to feel again. "I care for you too," she whispered. "More each day." Mason's expression softened. "I'm not asking for promises now, only that you'll allow me to continue courting you properly with this understanding between us." Emma squeezed his hand. "I would like that very much." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the weight of unspoken possibilities settling comfortably between them. When Mason finally leaned over to place a gentle kiss on her cheek, Emma felt as though something long twisted inside her had finally unraveled, making space for new growth. As they rode back to the fort with the setting sun painting the landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Emma reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought her to this moment. A devastating tornado had destroyed her home, but had also blown Mason Irwin into her life. Perhaps there was meaning in that, a reminder that sometimes destruction cleared the way for rebuilding something even stronger. The following weeks saw their courtship flourish into something the entire community recognized as serious. Mason formally called on Emma at the fort, bringing small gifts: a ribbon for her hair, a book of poetry, wildflowers gathered from the prairie. They attended social gatherings together, shared meals with friends, and spent quiet evenings in conversation. October brought Mason's official appointment as sheriff of Fort Laramie, celebrated with a small ceremony at the town hall. Emma sat proudly in the front row as he took his oath of office, his eyes finding hers as he promised to uphold the law and protect the community. That evening, at a dinner held in his honor at the officers' mess, Mason surprised Emma by asking her to step outside for a private word. The night air carried the first real chill of autumn, and Emma drew her shawl closer around her shoulders as they walked a short distance from the building. "Are you cold?" Mason asked, concern evident in his voice. "A little," Emma admitted, "but it's a beautiful night." The sky above them was a tapestry of stars, the Milky Way a brilliant swath across the darkness. From somewhere in the distance came the plaintive howl of a coyote, answered by another farther away. Mason led her to a small bench beneath a cottonwood tree, its leaves rustling softly in the night breeze. Once seated, he took both her hands in his. "Emma," he began, his voice uncharacteristically nervous, These past months have been the happiest of my life. Getting to know you, watching your strength and grace in rebuilding your life, has been a privilege." Emma felt her pulse quicken, sensing the importance of this moment. "I know it hasn't been long," Mason continued, "and if you feel it's too soon, I'll understand completely. But I find I can't wait any longer to ask." He released her hands only to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a small object that glinted in the starlight. "Emma Hayes, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" The ring he held was simple but beautiful, a small pearl set in gold, flanked by tiny blue stones that reminded Emma of Mason's eyes. "It was my mother's," he explained softly. "The only thing I have left of her." Tears welled in Emma's eyes, spilling over before she could stop them. "Yes," she whispered, her voice catching. "Yes, I will marry you, Mason." His face broke into a smile of such joy that Emma felt her heart might burst. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, she marveled at how perfectly it fit, as if it had been waiting all along for this moment. Mason's kiss was gentle at first, then deepened with a passion that left them both breathless. When they finally parted, he rested his forehead against hers, their shared breath creating small clouds in the cool night air. "I never expected to find love again," Emma confessed. "After Thomas died, I thought that part of my life was over." "And I never expected to find it at all," Mason replied. "Yet here we are." They returned to the celebration hand in hand, their news quickly spreading through the gathering. Congratulations and well wishes surrounded them. But Emma hardly heard them, too caught up in the wonderful reality of her engagement. Later that night, as she prepared for bed in her small quarters, Emma stood by the window, twisting her new ring in the moonlight. The journey from the day of the tornado to this moment seemed both impossibly long and surprisingly short. She thought of Thomas, allowing herself to remember him with fondness rather than pain. He would have approved of Mason, she believed would have wanted her to find happiness again. Perhaps it was no coincidence that it was the storm cellar Thomas built that had brought Mason into her life, as if even in death he had found a way to provide for her future. With that comforting thought, Emma slipped into bed, dreams of her new beginning filling her mind as she drifted into peaceful sleep. The wedding took place on a crisp November day in Fort Laramie's small church. The modest building was filled to capacity with well-wishers from both the military and civilian communities. Emma wore a new dress of deep blue silk, ordered specially from Cheyenne, with Mrs. Whittaker's cameo brooch pinned at her throat and wildflowers in her hair. Mason stood tall and handsome in a new black suit, his badge polished to a high shine on his chest. When Emma walked down the aisle on the arm of Captain Williams, who had kindly offered to give her away, the look of absolute devotion on Mason's face nearly brought her to tears. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. They exchanged traditional vows, their voices steady and sure. When Reverend Walsh pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the assembled guests seemed to lift the very rafters of the church. The celebration afterward, held in the fort's mess hall, lasted well into the evening. There was dancing, feasting, and toasting, with even the most reserved officers joining in the festivities. Emma and Mason moved through it all in a happy daze, accepting congratulations and good wishes from everyone they encountered. As the evening wound down, Mason led his new wife to the small house that was now their home, a tidy structure near the sheriff's office that had been included with his position. Though modest in size, it was sturdy and well built, with a proper kitchen, a comfortable parlor, and 2 bedrooms. "Welcome home, Mrs. Irwin," Mason said softly as he carried Emma across the threshold. The name still sounded new and wonderful to her ears. "It's perfect," she replied, taking in the simple furnishings they had collected over the past weeks. A quilt made by the women of Fort Laramie adorned their bed, a wedding gift that represented hours of shared work and goodwill. Books lined shelves that Mason had built himself, and a cast-iron cookstove gleamed in the kitchen, ready for Emma's skilled hands. That night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their new home, Emma felt a sense of rightness that transcended all the uncertainty and loss that had preceded this moment. The tornado that had destroyed her previous life had, through some mysterious working of fate, delivered her to this new one filled with love and possibility. "What are you thinking?" Mason asked, his voice a rumble in the darkness as his fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "That sometimes the most destructive storms clear the way for new growth," Emma replied, nestling closer to him. "And that I'm grateful, despite everything, for the tornado that brought you to my door." Mason's arms tightened around her. "Then we're both grateful. Though I wish there had been a less traumatic way for us to meet." Emma smiled against his chest. "Perhaps, but I wouldn't change how things turned out, not for anything." "Nor would I," Mason agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Not for anything in this world." The winter passed in a blur of domestic happiness for the newlyweds. Emma quickly became known as a gracious hostess, making their small home a warm gathering place for friends and colleagues. Mason's duties as sheriff kept him busy, but he always returned home to Emma with the same look of wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe his good fortune in having her as his wife. Spring brought new beginnings. The railway construction that had been surveyed the previous year began in earnest, bringing fresh activity and commerce to Fort Laramie. Emma, no longer needed as a laundress at the fort, opened a small bakery in town, using skills learned from her mother to create bread and pastries that quickly gained popularity. It was also in spring that Emma discovered she was with child. The news brought joy to both of them, though Mason's happiness was tinged with a protectiveness that sometimes made Emma laugh. "I'm perfectly capable of continuing to work," she insisted one evening as they sat on their front porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, most of them while continuing to perform far more strenuous labor than baking bread." Mason looked sheepish. "I know. It's just," he placed his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "This is precious to me. You are precious to me." Emma covered his hand with her own. "And you to me, but you must promise not to treat me as if I might break. I'm made of sturdier stuff than that, as you well know." "As I was reminded the moment I met you," he agreed with a smile. "Very well, but you will tell me if you need help." "I promise," Emma said, leaning over to kiss him softly. "Now tell me about your day. I heard there was some excitement at the saloon." As Mason recounted a minor disturbance involving a cavalry private and a card game, Emma felt a deep contentment wash over her. Their life together was not without challenges. Mason's job carried inherent dangers, and the frontier itself presented constant hardships, but they faced everything as partners, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. By summer, Emma's pregnancy was visible, her dresses let out to accommodate her changing figure. The bakery continued to thrive under her management, with the help of young Sarah Johnson, who had shown an aptitude for baking and a willingness to learn. This arrangement allowed Emma to rest when needed while ensuring the business remained open. One evening in late July, as a thunderstorm rolled across the plains, Emma and Mason sat in their parlor, reading companionably. The rumble of distant thunder made Emma glance up from her book. "Reminds me of the day we met," she said softly. Mason set aside his newspaper. "Not quite as severe, thankfully." No, Emma agreed, placing a hand on her rounded belly as the baby kicked vigorously, though someone seems excited by the storm. Mason moved to sit beside her on the settee, his hand joining hers. Strong like his mother, he said with a smile as he felt the movement beneath his palm. Or her father, Emma countered. The baby's gender remained a happy mystery, though both had their private hopes. A particularly loud crack of thunder made Emma jump slightly, and Mason's arm went around her shoulders. "It's passing to the north," he assured her. "The worst of it won't reach us." Emma nodded, but found herself remembering that day over a year ago when another storm had not passed them by, when the black funnel cloud had borne down on her home with terrifying speed. The memory still had the power to make her heart race. Mason seemed to sense her distress. "We have a storm cellar here too," he reminded her gently. "And this house is sturdy. You're safe." "I know." Emma leaned into his embrace. "It's not fear exactly, just remembering. We've come a long way since then," Mason observed, his fingers tracing soothing circles on her arm. Emma nodded, thinking of all that had changed. From a widow facing total loss to a wife, soon-to-be mother and business owner, her transformation seemed almost as dramatic as the landscape after a tornado's passage. "I sometimes wonder about fate," she mused. "If that tornado hadn't struck when it did, you would never have seen my house, never stopped to check if anyone needed help." "I like to think our paths would have crossed eventually," Mason replied. "Fort Laramie isn't so large that we wouldn't have met at some point." "Perhaps," Emma agreed. "But would we have noticed each other, really seen each other, the way we did in that moment of crisis?" Mason considered this. "Maybe not immediately, but I believe we would have found each other, one way or another." The certainty in his voice warmed Emma more than any fire could have. "You sound very sure." "I am," he said simply. "Some things are meant to be, Emma, not predetermined exactly, but aligned, like stars finding their proper constellation." The poetry of this thought, coming from her usually practical husband, made Emma smile. "Then I'm glad our stars aligned, Mason Irwin." "As am I," he replied, bending to kiss her as the storm rumbled on outside, powerless now to disturb their peace. Their son was born on a clear September morning, a healthy, robust boy with a shock of dark hair like his father's and eyes that promised to be as blue. They named him Thomas Mason Irwin, honoring both Emma's first husband and his father. "He's perfect," Mason whispered, cradling his son with a mixture of awe and terror that made Emma laugh despite her exhaustion. "He is," she agreed, watching her husband's face as he counted fingers and toes for the third time. "And so are you, holding him like that." The first year of young Thomas's life brought challenges and joys in equal measure. The baby thrived, growing strong and curious about the world around him. Emma managed to balance motherhood with her bakery responsibilities, often wearing Thomas in a sling while she worked the early morning hours before Sarah arrived. Mason took to fatherhood with unexpected ease, his initial nervousness giving way to confident delight in his son's development. He carved wooden toys for the boy, read to him from law books and dime novels alike, and wasn't above making silly faces to elicit the baby's infectious laughter. Fort Laramie itself continued to grow and change around them. The railway's completion brought increased commerce and new settlers. Emma's bakery expanded to include a small cafe section where travelers and locals alike could enjoy coffee and fresh pastries. Mason's responsibilities as sheriff grew accordingly, though he maintained the town's reputation as a relatively peaceful stop along the frontier. It was on the second anniversary of the tornado, a date that held significance for them both, that Mason surprised Emma with a proposal. "I've been thinking," he said as they sat on their porch after putting Thomas to bed. the spring evening mild and fragrant with blooming wildflowers. Again with the dangerous thinking, Emma teased, echoing their old joke. Mason smiled, taking her hand. I've saved quite a bit over these past 2 years, and with the bakery doing so well. Emma tilted her head questioningly. What are you suggesting? Your land, Mason said simply. Your homestead. I thought perhaps we might rebuild there. Emma's breath caught. She had maintained ownership of the land but had scarcely visited it since that day with Mason before their engagement. The thought of returning permanently had never occurred to her. But your position as sheriff is secure, Mason finished, but not the only path available to me. The railroad has brought law and commerce, Emma. The wild frontier is changing. Maybe it's time we changed with it. You want to be a farmer? Emma asked incredulously. Mason laughed. Not exactly, but a man who knows the law has options. I could practice privately, help settlers with land claims and contracts, or perhaps run for county judge when the territory eventually achieves statehood. He squeezed her hand. The point is, we have choices now. And I thought you might want the option of reclaiming what was taken from you. Emma considered this. The land had been good fertile soil, access to water, beautiful vistas. And there was something appealing about rebuilding on the site of her greatest loss, transforming it into the foundation for her greatest joy. We could build something larger than the original house, she mused, warming to the idea. With a proper room for Thomas and perhaps space for more children someday. Mason's eyes lit up. And a study for me, maybe a larger kitchen for your baking, and a wide porch facing west to catch the sunsets, Emma added, the vision growing clearer in her mind. Is that a yes? Mason asked, his expression hopeful. Emma leaned forward to kiss him softly. It's a let's consider it seriously. We have a good life here in town. I wouldn't want to leave behind everything we've built unless we're both certain. Fair enough, Mason agreed. But we could ride out there next Sunday, couldn't we? Just to look, to see if it still speaks to you the way it once did. And so, on a bright spring Sunday, they packed a picnic lunch and loaded Thomas into a small wagon Mason had borrowed for the occasion. The journey to Emma's former homestead was filled with Thomas's delighted observations of birds, prairie dogs, and wildflowers, his vocabulary expanding daily in a way that amazed both his parents. When they crested the final rise and Emma's land came into view, she felt a strange mixture of emotions. The ruins of the original house had been largely reclaimed by nature, with only a few timber remnants and the stone foundation still visible. The storm cellar remained, its door replaced by Mason during one of his occasional checks on the property. But it was the land itself that captured Emma's attention, rolling prairies stretching toward distant mountains, dotted with wildflowers and a few young cottonwoods taking root near the creek. It was beautiful in its wild simplicity, full of possibility. They spread their picnic blanket near the old foundation, allowing Thomas to toddle about under their watchful eyes as they discussed what might be built there. Mason had brought paper and pencil, sketching rough plans based on Emma's descriptions and his own ideas. We could start construction this summer, he suggested. Be moved in before winter. Emma watched her son playing among the wildflowers, his dark hair catching the sunlight, his laughter carrying on the breeze. She thought of the woman she had been when she first came to this land with Thomas Hayes young, hopeful, a bit naive about frontier life. And she thought of the woman she was now, stronger, wiser, deeply loved. Yes, she said finally, turning to Mason with a smile that held all the certainty she felt. Let's rebuild here. Let's make this our home. Mason's answering smile was radiant. He pulled her close, his kiss a promise sealed beneath the vast Wyoming sky. From destruction to creation, he murmured against her hair. Full circle. Emma nodded, watching their son chase a butterfly across land that would soon support their new home, their expanding family, their shared future. "The tornado took much from me," she said softly, "but it gave me you and Thomas and a life more beautiful than I could have imagined." Above them, a meadowlark trilled its distinctive song, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of sage and summer grass. Emma leaned against Mason's shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. The past with its losses, and the future with its promises, seemed to converge in this perfect moment, this patch of Wyoming earth where a devastating storm had once raged, and where now love and hope took root instead, stronger and more enduring than any force of nature. As Thomas ran back to them, arms outstretched for his father to lift him high into the air, Emma knew with absolute certainty that they had found their true home at last, not in a place, but in each other.